Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, for today's agenda, we are going to tackle the budget of the state universities and colleges. That will include the University of the Philippines system and the annex list of SUCs that we will later on read, Mr. President. In the meantime, may I ask that Senator Angara be recognized to present the budget of the state universities and colleges. And then Senator Lacson will interpolate.
The budget of the state universities and colleges, Mr. Majority Leader, can for the record, which of these SUCs?
May we ask the sponsor to enumerate, Mr. President? In the
Thank you,
meantime,
yes.
yes.
Will the sponsor spread on the record the SUCs whose budgets are now under consideration?
Yes, good morning, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues. Good morning to the SUCs, the CHED, and the higher education family, to our colleagues. The NEP budget for the SUCs, NEP is 56,090,216,000. The GAB is 57,436,585,000, Mr. President. Okay.
Under consideration is the GAB, not the NEP anymore. So will the good sponsor enumerate for the record what are the SUCs under consideration, or is it the whole bunch of SUCs?
It is all the SUCs, Mr. President. That's
All the SUCs.
114 SUCs under consideration.
114 SUCs. So for the record, what does the General Appropriations Bill budget, what does the GAB indicate as the budget for all the SUCs?
It is 57,436,585,000, Mr. President.
All right.
May you recognize Senator Lacson, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The period of interpolation is recognized.
Yeah, if the gentleman from Aurora and the Republic of the Philippines is willing to yield to very few clarificatory questions.
Most willingly to the gentleman from Cavite, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. The budget of the SUCs for 2016 under the NEP is 2017. Correction, 2017 under the NEP amounted to 56 billion plus. This was increased to 57.4 billion in the GAB or in the House version, and to 57.8 billion in the Senate Finance Committee report. Is that correct, Mr. President?
Could you repeat your figure for the Senate Committee report? I just
Senate Committee report, yes. 57.838
yes, that's
billion.
Correct, Mr. President.
But the House version, the so-called GAB2, or what we refer here on the floor as the GAB,
yes,
General Appropriations Bill, 57.436 billion.
That's right, Mr.
So that is correct.
Yes.
And the breakdown is as follows, no? PS, it was increased in the GAB by, never mind, that's negligible. MOE, andito yung remarkable increase. From 11.262 billion, it was increased in the GAB to 12.346 billion. An incremental increase of 1.083 billion pesos. Is that correct, Mr. President?
I believe so, Mr. President. I think that represents the increase went to the Tulong Dunong program, which is mostly scholarships. Or
So that's the
yes.
Tulong Dunong program.
That's right, Mr. President.
Well, is Tulong Dunong program being used as the scholarship program of congressmen?
I think they are allowed to recommend, Mr. President. Yes.
I would like to invite your attention to the 2015 COA audit report. Ito, ang reference po nito, Philippine Normal University. Ito yung statement ng COA. The Tulong Dunong appropriation of 10 billion or 10,928,000 pesos was allocated by the DBM for the scholarship programs of the 18 members of the House of Representatives, which implementation was attended by delays, confusion due to absence of clear written guidelines, and limited coverage to the constituent selected scholars of the concerned legislators. Ang punto ko rito, Mr. President, is hindi ba bawal na yung PDAP under the 2013 ruling of the Supreme Court?
Well, I haven't read that. It's been 3 years since I read the ruling, but I'll try to make sure I get it right. I think what the Supreme Court prohibited, Mr. President, was post-enactment interference in the budget. But I think a recommendation, it did not prohibit congressmen from submitting requests or recommendations to various institutions.
I just want to be clarified, Mr. President, because baka madamay tayo rito.
Yes.
Because it's not only the House of Representatives that's in charge of enacting the budget, di ba?
That's true.
Pati tayo magpapas eh. And if we
right.
allow ourselves to be party to the passage of a bill, General Appropriations Bill, that is fraught with pork barrel, baka po pati tayo masama. So yun ang aking concern. And I want to put it on record, if you say that this is compliant sa Supreme Court ruling, then I have no problem.
Yes.
But it is not it's not up to us to conclude or decide kung ito ba pwede i-classify as PDAP. Ang understanding ko, simple lang eh. Pag ang nag-implement hindi executive, because if we will go back to the budget cycle, yung budget process, di ba meron tayong tinatawag na preparation phase.
Yes.
And this is purely executive. Authorization phase, this is purely legislature, di ba? Legislative function yan. Execution, it goes back to the executive.
Yes.
And what if the congressman or any legislator for that matter are the ones, or any legislator for that matter, are the ones implementing the scholarship program? Hindi ba nag-encroach yung legislature doon sa function ng executive sa execution ng budget?
It's a fine point, Mr. President. And the Supreme Court, I remember in the DAP decision, they traced the appropriations language or the general provisions with regarding the legislative funds. And from the early days, the language was permissive, meaning legislators could recommend. But over the years, the language became more compulsory, meaning executive was bound to accept what the legislators recommended. And the Supreme Court laid down the law that there should be no post-enactment legislation, although nothing prevents legislators in the exercise of their functions from recommending. And on the part of the executive, they have the right to exercise their judgment. They are not bound to accept the recommendation of the legislators, Mr.
Thank
President.
you, Mr. Sponsor. For the sake of transparency, may we know who are the proponents of the amount of 1,083,841,000 pesos corresponding to the scholarship program under the SUCs? Sino-sino po itong mga legislators? Just for transparency, para maliwanag lang.
Do you have the breakdown? I don't know the proponents because this happened in the House, Mr. President, but I can read to you the institutions which benefited.
The SUCs.
Yes.
Hindi tayo full transparency. For the sake of our colleagues who are present on the floor,
Opo.
di ba, mas magandang sabihin na natin para malinaw kung sino yung mga proponents. Yung SUCs, okay lang yon, that's fine. And I'm not questioning the motive. I'm not questioning the purpose kasi may mga scholars din sila. But gusto ko lang maliwanag na the Senate, but of course, during the period of amendment at saka sa BICAM, will have a hand, definitely, in the passage of this bill, of the General Appropriations Bill. And I don't want to be a party to something that is questionable under the Supreme Court ruling. So I am just signifying my strong reservations.
Yes, Mr.
on the
President.
matter.
I will make sure the language is compliant
Yeah, please
with respect to the provisions in the. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
kindly
Vice Chair.
identify.
Yeah.
Please continue and identify the SUCs involved.
The Eulogio. No, there's no change. Marikina Polytechnic College went up by 360,000.
And under what district?
It does not indicate, Mr. President.
Kindly ask the
I will find out. I'll
resource
find out. Philippine Normal University went
Where?
up by 3.25
PNU
million.
where?
PNU is here in quite not far from the Senate, actually, here in Manila, Mr. President.
Manila. Under what district?
It's a general university, kind of like a UP, and because it's
Yes, please continue.
Philippine State College of Aeronautics, or PhilSC. There's no change there. Polytechnic University of the Philippines, Mr. President, increased by 5.644 million pesos. RTU, Rizal.
This is Polytechnic University of the Philippines, Maine, in Santa Mesa.
I think so. I believe so, Mr. President. There's no indication in the GAB, but it just says Polytechnic and Higher Education Services, Mr. President. The next is Rizal Technological University, or RTU, which went up by 7 million pesos.
Rizal
Technological University.
Technological. Located where?
I believe this is in Mandaluyong, Mr.
Mandaluyong.
President. Yes.
Okay. And how many districts are there in Mandaluyong, Sir President?
I think there's
Only one district.
I think there's
Okay.
only one. Oh.
So next, Mr. Chairman.
Next
Mr.
is,
President.
Mr. President, is TUP, or Technological University of the Philippines, which went up by 6 million pesos.
May I ask, how much would it cost to finance a scholar?
The cost
For 1 year,
varies.
for 1 year, one budget year.
I think what is recommended by the CHED and the SUCs is 12,000.
12,000, so
average.
6
Yes.
million pesos would correspond to how many scholars?
But when I say that, Mr. President, I'd like to indicate that some schools are some are higher.
On the average, it's 12,000.
On the average, yes. But some specialty schools are on the high side. TUP is.
So that's more or less 500 scholars. Tama ba? 500 yeah, scholars. Marami yun
12 pa rin ang binibigay.
Maraming constituents.
Yeah, maximum of 12 ho.
Yeah,
Yung-
please continue.
Don Mariano Marcos Memorial State University.
In Ilocos,
Is that the La Union or Ilocos?
La Union.
It's in La Union, Mr.
How many
President.
districts are there in La Union? And which district has jurisdiction over Mariano Marcos State University in La Union, Mr. President?
I'll find out, Mr. President. I don't know offhand. I'm sorry.
Anyway, please continue.
Yeah, I've been to that
How
school.
much?
I've been to that school, but I don't know whose district is in. When I went, it was I was a guest of Congressman Vic Ortega at the time. Yeah, that went up by 13 million, Mr. President. Ilocos Sur Polytechnic went up by 2.8 million. Mariano Marcos, I believe this is the one in Ilocos Norte, went up by 9.4 million. North Luzon Philippines State College went up by 6 million. Pangasinan State University went up by 8.2 million. University of Northern Philippines, I think this is in Ilocos Sur, went up by 1.5 million. Abra State went up by 13 million. Apayao State went up by 5 million. Benguet State went up by 13 million. Ifugao State went up by 10 million. Kalinga State went up by 20 million. Mountain Province State went up by 23 million rather. Batanes went up by Batanes State College went up by 4 million. I can submit it to, or would you like me to read all of it into the record?
No, never mind. Kindly
Yeah.
just submit
I can
to the,
submit
to
to
the
give you a
body.
list,
Yes.
sir, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Eto na. I also noticed that 12 SUCs have received a significant increase in the Senate version, no, compared to the GAB.
Yes.
How much is the increase total? So that's between 12.346 billion in the House version. It was increased further to 12.375. So hindi naman masyadong malaki. I won't belabor the issue. I just want to drive home the point na we're treading on very, very thin ano rito.
Yes,
di ba?
yes.
Kaya,
I understand the point of the gentleman from Cavite, also the Vice Chairman, Mr. President, that we might be encroaching on illegalities if we're not careful with how we frame language and how we create programs under the General Appropriations Act. I understand, Mr.
Another
President.
issue that I'd like to point out is the issue of equitability. Why are these SUCs favored over the others? Kasi how many SUCs do we have total? Bakit napili lang yata yung mga SUCs na madagdagan?
Mr. President, I think all received increases, if I'm not mistaken.
Across the board?
Yes, yes. Although the
Hindi.
figures are not identical.
Sa
Anyway,
Senate,
we
for
will
example,
submit you the list so you can see
yeah,
if...
sa Senate, for example, Philippine Normal University, 21.5 million. Don Mariano Marcos, pareho rin eh. Pareho rin ng, alam nyo, may scholarship na doon yung mga congressmen. May scholarship pa rin doon yung Senate. How about the other SUCs located in other areas?
yung sa...
Walang equitability rito.
Yung sa PNU ho, galing sa Senate, they asked for that because it was cut by the DBM ho. In fact, they asked for 57 million.
So, na-restored lang ito?
Restored. Halos lahat po yun restored lang ho. In fact, most of them were cut, but they asked for restoration. And we tried to be as equitable as possible. Yung sa PNU kasi, yun ay mga doctorate... PNU is the Center of Excellence for Teaching ho. So, because it's a normal university. And the scholarships were in aid of our teachers who are already in Malaysia, in Thailand. Kapag binarat po natin yung budget, they will be unable to finish. Sayang naman ho yung na-invest din natin sa kanila.
Thank you, Mr. President. Merong across the board additional capital outlay allocation of 1.5 million for almost all SUCs in the Senate version. Ang tanong dito, meron pa bang buildable space? Meron pa bang space na pwedeng para magkaroon ng improvement yung mga SUCs?
Well, it varies, Mr. President, but I think most SUCs still have room for a slight improvement. Some have thousands of hectares, in fact, like CMU in Bukidnon, and yung sa, what's the one in North Cotabato? Yeah, some of the agricultural colleges have a lot of land, Mr. President, that they need to develop.
Okay. There are other issues, but I won't belabor anymore because we are both Vice Chairman of the Finance Committee, so I'll be kinder. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you sa ating sponsor.
I thank the gentleman Cavite for being kind to the SUCs, and we assure him that we will make sure the language is compliant with the Supreme Court's decision in the DAP. Thank you very much, Mr. President, gentleman from Cavite.
Thank you. Any other member of the chamber who wishes to interpolate on the SUCs?
Mr. President, I believe the minority leader made a reservation last night.
Senator Ralph Rector, the minority leader, wishes to avail of the period of interpolation, is so recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the distinguished sponsor of the budget of the SUCs and SHED yield to a few questions?
It will be an honor to be interpolated by the very hardworking minority leader who's a staunch advocate for quality education.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the remarks, Mr. President. Let me begin by saying that all government agencies should be thinking about, number one, know their client. Number two, ensure quality service at the least possible cost. With regard to SUCs and SHED, I suppose the challenge is more or less the same, access to quality education at the least possible cost. Having said that, Mr. President, I am not sure if the SUCs and the SHED personnel and officers were here when we began the interpolation of the general principles of the budget. And I made mention, Mr. President, to put context into our discussion this morning, that in 2015, the total budget of the national government was roughly 2.7 trillion. But the adjusted appropriation, because of the continuing appropriations of the previous years, hindi nagastos was 3.5 trillion.
Total obligations in 2015 was 2.5 trillion. Disbursements was only 2.1 trillion. Meaning to say, may 1 billion na carry over noong 2016. Okay? And I said, if government can spend this money, the economy would not just grow by 6 or 7%. I think any president today, because of how strong the economy is, will generically grow by 6 to 7%. But if you improve the absorptive capacity of the government to spend, the utilization rate, easily government can grow by 10 to 13%. And you could create more jobs in the process and reduce poverty at a faster rate, not to mention be more competitive in Southeast Asia and in the entire global community. Now, in 2016, it even became worse. In 2016, the total budget adjusted was 3.3 trillion. The obligations was 1.3 trillion and the disbursement was only 1 trillion. Meaning to say, if we are discussing here a budget next year of 3.4 trillion and the budget cycle is 2 years, the authority of the president next year will actually be more than 3.4 trillion, would actually be more or less 4.4 trillion pesos, Mr. President. Okay? Now, how does that relate now to the SUC budget? I mentioned, Mr. President, ways of spending the budget, improving it in the last few days. One way for sure to improve the absorptive capacity of government, and the best way to improve the economy is, of course, infrastructure, investments in agriculture, investments in the rural area, and human, aside from social protection, human capital development, healthcare, and education. We've already finished discussions on the DepEd budget. We are now in the SUC budget. I am glad to note also, Mr. President, and I think we should congratulate the Budget Secretary on this matter, that the total budget of the SUCs, I think we have about 112 SUCs and UP. Okay? Nung araw, lopsided masyado ang per capita spending in favor of UP compared to the SUC. Today, the budget increase in 2016 and in 2017 for UP is more or less the same, but for the SUCs, lumalaki naman as a percentage of the total SUC and UP budget. Let me begin by asking, how much is the per capita spending per student sa UP?
It's about approximately 126,000 pesos, Mr. President, distinguished colleague.
The budget of UP is roughly 13 billion. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
And how many students do you have?
Around 60,000, Mr. President.
60,000. If you divide, I'm sorry, including postgraduate,
Yes, Your Honor.
okay? But when we talk about the 13 billion, this is just the subsidy of the national government.
Opo, may endowment fund din po ang UP.
Oo, di ba?
Yes.
So I have here 46,000 students. So ito yung undergrad lang.
Yun po yung undergrad,
Okay.
Mr. President.
Because kung undergrad lang, and the base is 13, it's 283,000 per student. Now, if it's 60, it's more than 200,000 per student.
Kasama po yung PGH, kailangan alisin daw po yung PGH.
Okay, so wala nang additional subsidy ang PGH. from the
Meron pa rin
national-
ho. But I think the figure of 283 cited by the distinguished minority leader would go down if you remove the,
Yeah, but isn't there another subsidy for PGH in the national government budget?
kasama yun sa,
Or
it's
it's
part
just
of the
part of
13
that?
billion. It's
Okay,
part
now,
of the 13 billion.
magkano naman ang income ng UP? And don't mistake me, I'm not against UP.
Yes, yes, yes. You're just,
Okay.
you're just
In
inquiring.
fact, I
I'm
think we
waiting for
should be
the answer.
spending more for UP also.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President.
Income, total. One figure muna. Hindi, kasi meron kayong
Around 1.5 billion, Mr. President.
1.5 billion. If you add that to, total income na yun, including tuitions,
Including tuition, including their income generating
correct. Okay.
projects.
If you add that,
to 13.
magkano spending naman per student, it will still be higher. You're roughly at about 200,000, di ba?
if you add the income.
According to the president of UP, Mr. President, they are not spending all of that 1.5 billion because they're trying to build up. their
Yeah, I
endowment
understand,
fund.
but nevertheless, more or less,
More
you're
or less,
spending
yeah.
200,000 per
How-
student,
If you add it
thereabouts.
on the average,
Okay?
your average spending.
They're
Then,
computing.
maraming ibang subsidy ang PGH, PhilHealth na lang eh. May subsidy rin yan eh. Anyway, let me move on.
They gave me a figure of 141, Mr. President. It
Okay.
increases to go from
Okay.
126 to 141.
It should be much higher than that because if I add PGH pa and PhilHealth and whatever it is to PGH, it will be much higher than that. Okay. Anyway, let's go now to the SUCs. How much naman ang subsidy per SUC student?
It's around 27,000 paid for by the government, Mr. President.
Okay.
27,500.
And when you say 27,000, what year is that?
At present,
At present?
yes.
Okay. That's based on half the student population.
About 45%, Mr. President.
I'm
About
sorry?
45%.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, more or less half,
Half
yes.
the student
Yes.
population. So kung full student population, kung first year, second year, third year, I mean, a few years back, a year ago, 2 years ago, then it would even be lower. Is that correct?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Again.
I didn't quite get it. Sorry.
Okay, kung may budget ang SUC, today, the student population is half of what it used to be.
Ganun ba?
Yes. Kasi third and fourth year na lang di ba? O second to fourth. 3/4.
What is it what it used to be?
They say it's not half, Mr. President, but it's substantially reduced, but it's not
So
quite
what,
half.
3/4?
3/4?
Second, third, and fourth.
80, 90, what? What's the figure?
Yeah, the point
Around
is,
80% according to...
it's
the
a
President.
lower
Yes,
number.
Yes,
right?
Mr. President.
Kung full 4 years yan, then the number goes lower pa. Di
Yes,
ba?
Mr. President.
The subsidy. So, clearly, masyadong maliit din naman yung budget ng SUCs. If you take a look at it, spending. Okay? Mukhang very elitist naman tayo na dito sa Metro Manila lang ang UP. Of course, they come from the provinces as well, di ba? Okay, now, do we know also the average income
Yeah.
of a student from UP and a student from the SUC?
Average income, student from UP. Family income.
Yeah.
Family income, 650. Sa SUCs, magkano? Yeah, yeah. Sa SUCs.
The SUCs, they don't have the figure, Mr. President, but according to UP President, it's about 650,000 upwards. Family income.
Ang UP.
for 50% of their students.
Okay, so what's the average?
What's the average?
I mean, the first thing that we should know is who our clients are. Just like poverty, sino ba yung mahihirap, di ba?
Well, I think
But
There was a study,
you would say that the average student in the SUC income level will be much lower
than UP, ho?
than UP.
Definitely, because UP is slowly becoming
Correct.
populated by
Okay.
middle class.
Correct.
Yeah,
Middle
because of the
class and
competitive
rich. Yeah,
nature,
yeah.
and a lot of the public school graduates have been crowded out. I think.
Okay,
It's
okay.
somewhat different from many years ago.
Okay, so maliwanag, the subsidy we give to poorer students in the SUCs is much lower than the subsidies we give to richer students. Malaking difference,
UP
10
has
times
a
more.
subsidized tuition system where they try to make sure that the richer students are
No,
subsidizing.
we understand that, and that's why we
poorer
already
students.
counted the subsidy from the national government, the income maliit lang, 1.5, so on and so forth. I mean, I think that this is not a debatable fact, eh. Maliwanag
Yes,
naman
I
to,
see
eh.
your point,
Diba?
Minority Leader.
Okay.
You're
And
you're
remember,
right.
I'm not against UP, ha? In fact, like I said yesterday in the budget hearing of the DepEd, my favorite professor was Liling Briones from UP. Okay? Now, let me move on. And most of the things I've learned probably came from her and the UPF College of Public Administration, right? Okay.
They
Now-
trained you well.
Thank you for that. Precisely. Precisely.
Maybe too well.
Okay. Now, let me move on. Do we know how much total scholarships, I'm sure Chad will have a figure, magkano ba talaga ang total scholarships ng gobyerno? Would we have a number?
Mr. President, distinguished colleague, the number given here is 155,651 recipients of assistance from the government.
I'm sorry?
155,000.
No. Total
651.
value muna of scholarships.
that's-
How much is the scholarships in the total budget?
2,144,691,000,000.
That is for SUCs, or with the CHED.
Kasama may gaspe dyan.
I'm sorry.
Some gaspe. Oh.
It's not just for the SUCs, Mr. President, because there's also the GASPE program, which gives
Yeah.
vouchers to private. So it's a mix.
Okay.
It's a
What
mix.
about yung sa agriculture, what do you call that? The ASEF.
May scholarship pa ba kayo? Magkano? That's not in your budget. But do you know information about it?
According to them, the budget does not come from them. It's under the DA budget, but I'm still soliciting information if they have, Mr. President.
Who administers that? Agriculture Department or the CHED?
No, he's asking about the DE.
It's the DA, Department of Agriculture, Mr. President.
Okay. So how many government agencies have scholarship budgets? You have the DA, you have the CHED, DOST.
How many government agencies give scholarship? I think it's 50. 14 only? 40? 1/4.
About 14, Mr. President. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
About 14, 1/4.
14 government agencies administer. What is the total budget?
It's the total budget of all those. So ang liit nung sa inyo. Sino yung malaki doon?
According to them, it's 25 billion,
25 billion.
which I'm also surprised to hear how,
Total
how big the
scholarships.
figure is.
Okay. Okay. How much of that goes outside the country? How much is inside the country?
Oh, what about Tikari and all that? Hindi. Yung sa PNU. They have scholars out, doctorate students nila. But he's asking the total. How can you say it's not count? How much is outside?
For scholarships, they say it's all within the country because the ones I mentioned earlier for PhDs is counted under faculty development.
Yeah. Okay. And how much of that goes to public and how much of that goes to private?
25. About 63% goes to the public educational institutions and 37% to the private, Mr. President.
Okay. And why does 37% go to the private? What is the reason?
I think there is a constitutional provision which authorizes or mentions the complementarity of public and private education. And there was a time when public institutional or public higher educational institutions, facilities were not sufficient to absorb some of the student population. So I think in the 90s, they had programs like the GASPE, which is a voucher system, which introduced the voucher system to the country to allow these students to choose whether they wanted to go to public or private schools.
Okay. And I suppose aside from that, there will be some private institutions doing better in terms of quality than the private.
Certainly, Mr. President, if
Okay.
we look at the rankings, that would bear your point out.
Okay. But of course, I think that let me make a judgment call here now, that government should be providing better education than the private sector.
Certainly, and in
That
many
should be our desire, right?
in other countries, that is the case, Mr. President.
That is correct.
That the public educational system is the bulwark or the strong
Correct, correct.
quality in
Okay.
terms of quality.
Okay. Now, how many students do we have this year sa SUCs?
It's around 1.6 million, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. President.
1.6 million.
Oh, I'm sorry, 1.2. I stand corrected, Mr. President, distinguished colleague. It's 1.2 million.
1.2 million. Sure. This year, huh? Okay. What will it be next year? Kalahati, 800.
Let's just answer the question. Let's not complicate it. Which one is ang tanong? Anong sagot? So what's the answer to the question?
Be prepared for the sources of...
Can we have a 1-minute suspension, Mr. President?
Yes.
Yeah.
Session suspended.
Come up with a number. Ready to resume, Mr. President?
Session resumed.
Yes.
Again, I'd like to correct my answer again because the first answer I gave was the correct one, Mr. President. It's around 1.67 million. And next year, they're anticipating a lesser enrollment of around 1.5 million.
So 1.6 ngayon, next year magiging
According to the president of PASUK and CHED, it's around 1.5 million they're anticipating.
in SUCs?
Yes.
So, but next year you'll only have half the student population, di ba? Third and fourth, because of K to 12? Or 3 years? Ano ba yung next year? 3 years or today? Ano ba sila? 3 years na sila. No,
Anong tamang
SUCs. First to fourth year college. This year, third. This year, 2016. Next year, third and fourth na lang.
Let's try to simplify the answer, guys. Let's not have a debate here.
Mr. President, I think these are very basic questions. Huh?
Yeah, I'm surprised that they don't have the figures actually, Mr. President. Yeah. Huh?
But why is the decrease only 100,000 from 1.6 to 1.5? So what's the effect of K-12? It's minimal.
Well, they say the K-12 effect is minimal because there's still a lot of enrollees, according to them, Mr. President. Yeah. A lot of out of school who still enroll.
Are you sure about that? So, ulitin natin, 1.6, okay? We should be expecting half of that will be in the, may magagraduate din eh. 2 years na lang of 4. So, dapat yung kalahati, more or less, 800,000, assuming your number of 1.6 is correct. 800,000 na lang yan.
There's just like true academics, they're still debating the figures, Mr. President.
I can move on, Mr. President.
So what's the explanation?
If they can give me a short explanation,
Yeah.
we will try to answer your question, Mr. President.
That's very embarrassing, Chairman. So what is the effect?
And then you have the
Mr. President, according to a study they did, a survey they did of first semester enrollment between this year and last year, the effect was ranged from in different regions from 20%, 24% was the high.
What does that mean? What's the 24% was the high?
Meaning the effect,
reduction.
the decrease in enrollment.
Correct. Reduction should be 20 to 24%
Yeah.
because
But
1 year ang
nationwide,
nawala.
They were surprised that nationwide it's only minus 11.7%, Mr.
Okay.
President. Yeah.
So that's the data for this year.
Based on this survey showed here. Preliminary,
Okay.
It's a preliminary survey, so it could be wrong. If the sample was wrong, it might be inaccurate.
How did you do the survey?
Just 40% of
They asked all the higher educational institutions, around 2,000, but only 40% submitted. So
All, including the
even the private ones, yes.
Oh, you know, my question is just the SUCs.
I see. So SUC.
There are only 112 SUCs.
It's a bigger figure than 11 for the SUCs, Mr. President. It's 19%.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, lagyan na natin 20. O, kung next year another 20, di 40% ang nabawasan. Di ba?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, so what? 1.6 minus 40% is what?
That's about
So, mga 900,000 na lang yung estudyante mo,
100,
more or less. Let's
about
continue.
950,
Roughly,
960.
sige.
yes.
Okay, let's continue. Okay, so, 900,000 students, SUC. Assuming we were to give them full scholarship, magkano naman yon?
900 times
Remember, hindi libreng edukasyon to. There are other costs. The idea is to reduce the cost of education. Same thing with healthcare. So later we will debate the health budget naman. Okay? With the Senate amendments, meron na tayong
Times 40,000.
universal health coverage, but still malaki ang out-of-pocket expense.
Yes, I
So
agree.
how do you reduce that? So similar for education, what can be done? Yes. Considering that the budget next year will not only be 3.4 trillion, but 4.4 more or less trillion. Authority of the President to spend.
Mr. President, distinguished colleague, regarding your question about how much it would cost to give tuition or subsidize the education of those in the SUCs with a base of or an assumption of 900,000 students at 40,000 per student.
Why is it 40? What is the average tuition fee?
The average tuition fee is computed around 12,000.
Oh,
And
yun lang
then,
naman ang
and
sinasabi
then the
ko.
cost is 27,000. That's what the government subsidizes.
No,
Mr.
no, no.
President. Yeah.
Nandun na yung 20, nandun na yung...
Okay, okay.
Nandyan na yung 40, next year nga, 56 billion eh.
90 times 2.
When we calculated the 47,
10.8.
the 27, that's at 47 billion lang, di ba?
10.8.
Oh. Yung dagdag lang, how much does it cost?
It's around 10.8 billion.
That's 900,000 times 12,000,
Times 12,000 tuition.
diba? 10 billion.
10.8 billion.
Okay, and you can give free. Okay, now, magkano bang nakokolekta ng SUC sa tuition?
That's the figure.
For 2015, Mr. President, the figure is approximately 9.5 billion.
9.5 billion for 2015.
Yeah.
So it is more or less the same amount, higher pa for less students. Right?
Yes, Mr. President. It's a smaller amount for estimated for next year. It's 7.8 billion approximately.
Okay? So, if we can find 10 billion, would there be any objection to further subsidize or reduce the cost of education for students in SUCs?
I don't think anyone would object to that, Mr. President. That's worthy.
You know, I took this up last year and I heard some objections.
Well, I think, since we're
And
dealing
our
with...
economy is in a stronger position even today.
I agree, Mr. President, and I laud you for your worthy initiatives. Before before others took up the cause, you were already espousing this cause of free. But there is a debate of what is the most equitable method of doing it. They're not against making tuition in all public HEIs or higher education institutions.
Before that, you may answer that. Before that, magkano ba talaga yung out-of-pocket expense nga naman ng estudyante sa SUC?
Rick,
Is it 24,000? Is it higher? Kasi may mga miscellaneous fees naman yan, may mga other fees, di ba?
ano mong out of pocket expense? Answer the question. Ha? $30. Yeah, so times 2, 30.
Around the president of PASUK says it's around 15,000 per semester, so times 2, 30,000,
30.
Mr. President.
So in effect, 30,000, at kung yung mga estudyante nga anak na magsasaka at mangingisda, ang tulong natin dito, 12,000, maglalabas pa rin sila ng 18. Di ba?
Opo, kailangan pa rin nila. Mahirapan pa ho sila,
Correct.
Mr. President.
Correct. Okay, now, in the past, was there any time in our history na libre ba talaga ang tertiary education? Never.
I don't think it ever happened, Mr.
But
President.
what
Yeah.
years na tumaas yung tuition fees ba ng mga SUCs?
The deregulation, when did that?
1997 was when we deregulated.
Okay, and why did we do that at that time?
I think Congress passed a law deregulating.
No, what was the purpose?
Well, the actual cost of education went up, and schools were not able
No,
to keep pace.
you're talking about private, I'm talking about SUCs. When did we allow the SUCs to keep on raising fees?
I think there was inflation, according to the president, and which hit not only the private but even the public HEIs, Mr. President.
Yeah, on the private, I understand okay, I'll put it this way. The reason why we did that was you had the Asian crisis in '98. Prior to that, you also had a large fiscal deficit. Hindi kaya ng gobyerno i-subsidize. Okay, so we asked, and because the economy was doing bad, interest rates went up. After the '98 crisis, interest rates hit the roof at 30%. Right? Kaya tinamaan yung mga insurance, education,
Pre-need
private
companies,
sector, pre-need companies. And then ang gobyerno naman, walang pera. We said, or at that time, they said, dapat maging income generating yung SUCs. Kaya magtaas kayo ng tuition. Pagalingan kayo, magtaas kayo. We looked at SUCs now as commercial centers. Okay? Wala tayong primary surplus. Our debt to GDP was 30%. Interest expense. The debt to GDP was much higher, but the interest on the expense on the budget was 30%. Today, that's now down to 10%. Today, the economy is growing 7%. If we're talking about inclusive growth, best way to utilize the budget, aside from investments in infra, and not to mention, ang laki ng admin cost ng gobyerno. If you're CEO of the country, the first thing you look at before you raise taxes is to reduce unnecessary expenses and relocate that to more productive investments, di ba?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, and one is infrastructure, the other is
Human
resource
infrastructure, yeah.
development.
I agree, Mr. President. I think that's most crucial in our development
Correct.
of our nation.
So do you think if you have scholarships, if you reduce the cost of education, you think bibilis kaya yung utilization rate din ng gastos ng gobyerno? Magagastos ba yan?
I think-
Madaling i-disburse ba yan?
I think they're saying if you increase it too much, they might need to hire personnel to distribute as well and process applications, as well as you might need to
They
build more
have less,
facilities.
remember, they have less students. They have half the student population. Why will their admin costs go up?
Because they don't process all of those scholarships, Mr. President, I suppose. That's the explanation there.
I don't understand the statement of the gentleman. Okay, let me put it in simple terms naman. Magkano ang, so 10 billion ang pinag-uusapan natin, di ba?
Yes.
O sige. What were the amendments of the House? I was listening to Senator Lacson earlier. How much did they put in SUCs?
They put 1.3 billion in scholarships in SUCs.
O so, bakit sila naglagay ng scholarship?
Well,
Sa tingin ninyo, aside
sa tingin
from
ko po,
the political patronage,
opo.
aside from that,
Yes, yes. No, I think
the reality on the ground,
is
there is
people
a
need to help.
market,
Yes.
there is a political market, ang mga tao, mahal ang edukasyon, lumalapit sa congressman. Bakit naman sa Senado nagdagdag din tayo?
I think some went to MOE for scholarships and some went to capital outlay. Mr.
Okay,
President.
but the
Yeah.
common denominator, scholarship,
Pretty much, yes.
right?
Yes.
Because there is a market, mahal eh.
I do agree, Mr. President. In
Right?
fact, it's a big market.
Okay, now, we had a discussion on DSWD yesterday.
Yes, I caught part of it, Mr. President.
Okay?
Yeah.
So, bakit ang DSWD? May ganun din. Yung lumalapit sa kanila, ano yung una-una? Kalusugan, edukasyon. Bumaba kayo sa Senado mamaya, may tao sa labas lalapit sa'yo. Anong hihingin?
Usually medical assistance, Mr. President. And maybe as help with the tuition.
Eskwelahan, di ba?
Yeah, yes, yes.
Okay, so maliwanag. There is a need.
Certainly, Mr. President.
Okay, so magkano linigay ng Senado?
Hindi, faculty development yun sa PNU. What's the increase? The Senate?
It's 400, Mr.
400. All total amendments?
yes.
Okay. So 1.3 plus 4, magkano? 1.7?
Yes, Mr. President.
Magkano natitira na lang to provide full scholarship? Kung 10 tayo nag-umpisa.
10.8 minus
Tingin ko nga, mahal yung
1.7.
10.8.
That's
It's less than
9.1,
that,
9.1, Mr. President.
So 9.1 na lang. Full scholarship na tayo. Okay? Okay. Assuming bayaran natin yung kalahati ng tuition.
6,000 per unit per capita, Mr.
Diba?
President.
I mean, it can be done, right?
5.4.
Kung hindi yung buo. But I think we should endeavor to do that. Reduce the cost, right?
I do.
Okay,
I
now,
think it's a worthy
I'll show you other
initiative.
items. Okay. Do you know how much the traveling expenses of the government is?
I don't, Mr. President.
In 2015, it was 11.7 billion. Now, we have macroeconomic assumptions in the budget, di ba? What is the inflation rate as per budget estimate?
If I'm not
And
mistaken, it's
target.
around 3%.
3%, 2 to 4, gitna 3. Tama? Okay. You know, I discussed this last Tuesday also. How come for revenue projections, we use the macroeconomic assumption of inflation, but for expenditures, we do not? Okay? Now, how much is the budget proposed next year?
For which agency? For the SUCs or?
No, for traveling expenses. No, total government.
I don't know, Mr. President. I don't have it. Sorry.
17.6 billion. Kung bawasan kaya natin yung traveling expenses, from 17, bigay natin yung 6% increase. Magkano matitira? So we can reallocate that for SUCs. O another one, supplies and materials. Magkano supplies and materials ng gobyerno? 61.5 billion.
For 2017.
Magkano ang proposal next year?
I think it's 84 billion.
84 billion. Magkano ang diferensya? 23.
It's a big jump.
So kung ibalik lang natin sa 61, libre na yung edukasyon, pwede pa natin bigyan ng 12,000 na pamasahe lahat. 1,000 naman. Lahat ng estudyante. Di ko ba?
Yes, I'm sure the chair of the committee would consider your very noble proposals, distinguished colleague.
Okay? Oh, these are just examples, and I can cite many, many more. Oh, utilization rate of the different agencies. Yung ano,
Utilization rate. Average.
yung mga agency,
Most of the SUCs have a good utilization rate, Mr. President.
You know, we had discussions also on the NRIMC fund. What's appropriated next year is 30 billion. What is continuing this year na hindi nagastos, 30 billion. It will carry over next year, magkano yun? 60 billion. You can cut 30 billion there. MPBF, Miscellaneous Personal Benefit Fund. What is the utilization rate
Utilization rate ng MPBS.
over the last 3 years?
I'm sure it's quite low, Mr. President.
It's much, much low.
Yes.
So, I mean, kung gusto natin, pwedeng gawin. Easily, di ba?
I think we have to really be determined and single-minded in our pursuit, Mr. President.
Not only to provide the scholarship, but, you know, I'd like to also pursue one last point, Mr. President. Now that you have K to 12, and you have 2 years na lang sa education, 2018, magiging ano na lang, ilan na lang ang estudyante by 2018?
In
sa
the
kolehiyo?
higher educational
Yes.
institutions. Total, including public and private.
Public lang. SUCs lang ang pinag-uusapan natin eh. May 1 year mawawala ulit eh, di ba?
When the grade 12 enrolled for
1 year
first.
pa.
So what's the anticipated population?
Tama ba yan? Or 2 years na, fourth and first.
2018, Mr. President, is the year when the grade 12 will enroll, no?
Correct.
It's the first year.
So you have a 2-year
To
opportunity.
normalize. Yeah.
2-year opportunity, okay? A 2-year opportunity that you more or less have half the population, and this is the time when you make the investments in improving the facilities. You cannot, it's hard to construct, improve facilities when you have a full, what do you call that? Ano? Yung
Full occupancy rate according to...
full occupancy rate. So now nakalahati na lang for the next 2 years,
As you're coming
make
out.
the investments,
It's gone up year to year. It's gone up naman.
make the investments, improve the facilities of all SUCs in the country. I think if we do that, you're preparing for the future for even higher growth rates.
I see the different heads of agencies nodding, Mr. President, so I think they're in agreement with your proposal.
Okay? So there's a lot that can be done. And that in the future, there will be less resources. You mentioned 25 billion for scholarships.
Yes, Mr. President.
And we're not using that for our students from the provinces. Sa mga SECs natin. May umaalis ng bansa. May pupunta sa pribado. I'm not against that. All I'm saying is that our first job is to improve our own, and now that we can afford it, to improve our own SUCs. Give UP their fair share too. I understand that UP is the premier university. I have no problem with also, ang dami naman pondo eh, that we can make additional investments in UP. And a lot more Pagdating ng Lunes, we will be discussing the DICT naman, budget. The first area I think that the DICT should be investing in, as far as improving ICT, are also in UP and the, what do you call this, the SUCs, and BCDA as one, government property. Then eventually, just like UP, you have an ICT community. Why not have the same thing in all SUCs nationwide?
It's a good idea. It's a very good idea, Mr. President, because that would be an aggregator for jobs, for research.
Correct,
And
correct.
there would be value adding.
Pag graduate nila, may trabaho na rin kaagad. Di ba?
Yes.
Okay. So with that, I thank the sponsor for his patience and to the tertiary education community for taking time out and for being here with us today. At the appropriate time, I'm sure that the sponsor will join me in proposing amendments to the budget to improve our investments in the SUCs. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, distinguished Minority Leader, for your very probing and relevant questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, may we now recognize Senator Francis Escudero.
Senator Escudero is recognized.
Thank you, distinguished Majority Floor Leader. Thank you, Mr. President. Will the gentleman yield to a few questions, Mr. President?
I hope he's not going to ask me about local government because he was my law professor at UP. But yes, to the gentleman from Sorsogon.
Actually, I only have very few questions, Mr. President, but I'll take off from our Senator Recto, what Senator Recto was saying a while ago. Mr. President, sabi kanina ng ating chairman na ang kinakailangan o ang binabayaran sa tuition fee ay 10 bilyon, pero may concerns daw about it being equitable. Do I remember the gentleman's remarks correctly?
Yes, I think I would just like to explain if it's all right. I think the preference of the educational heads is to give vouchers to really target the poorest. So there's no free riding, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Senator Recto proposed this about 2 or 3 years ago when I was still finance chair, and that was the same answer given by the CHED to us. In fact, I remember that debate distinctly. Ang pinag-uusapan namin, dadagdagan ng pera at pondo yung mga SUCs tungkol sa scholarship. Ang sabi nila, ayaw, wag daw. And the answer given was equitable or equity. It's been 2 to 3 years. Wala pa rin bang formula on equity to? Dahil kung handa naman tayong ibigay yung 10 bilyon na kinakailangan dahil sa fiscal space na meron tayo, hanggang ngayon po ba, hindi pa rin handa yung ating tertiary education officials tungkol dito?
It's not an easy debate. Senator Villanueva is here. He was at the committee, and we discussed it at length also. What would be the best? That's why I think UP over time has developed some sort of socialized tuition, whereby the rich pay more in order to subsidize the truly poor. So I suppose that would be ideal if all SUCs were to adopt some kind of modification of that route. Although, given the fact that we really want, if we want to help the really truly poor, Mr. President.
I'm not blaming the gentleman, Mr. President, Your Honor. It's actually more our tertiary education officials. What have they done in the past 2 years along these lines to provide for an equitable solution or formula to this? It's not really a problem. We've been offering money for this. Sila yung palagi nagsasabing hindi handa, ayaw, hindi equitable, but if we can provide them with the money, 2-3 taon na, bakit wala pa hong solusyon hanggang ngayon? I know it's a long debate amongst us, between us, but that's their primary job. What have they done for the past 2 to 3 years since we last brought up this matter about 3 years ago? Since the first time, rather, we brought up this matter.
Mr. President, distinguished colleague, I think there have been incremental solutions. I think Congress passed the Scholar ng Bayan law, which was supported by our educational heads, to give priority to those graduating from the public schools. We also passed the Unifast law, which provided, among others, first that because studies show that a lot of dropouts happen because of not failure to pay tuition, but because of failure to pay ancillary or other fees. Unifast provided legal cover or support for the CHED to give larger forms of assistance, not just tuition. So if we look at it, those amounts have increased, but perhaps we should do more. And if that is the point of the gentleman, I do agree with him, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Honor, that's Congress's solution. If tomorrow or by the time we approve the budget on Monday or sometime in December, we actually give 10 billion, if you can source out 10 billion, and I'm sure we can source out 10 billion, in fact, less than that. Dahil sa ngayon, sabi mo nga, may na-allocate na tayo, roughly ng mga 2 billion in scholarships na dinagdag natin, dinagdag ng House, dinagdag ng Senate, so 8 billion na nga lang siguro yung hahanapin natin eh. And if the figures are correct too, we've been paying or we've been allocating 25 billion in scholarships. I don't know where it goes, actually. Because if we need 10 billion, we can even carve it out from there and simply provide free tertiary education. If you decide to vote on it and allocate such an amount, paano ho nila gagastusin? Equitable pa rin ba ang solusyon? Will it fall under the underspending of government simply because they still do not know after 2 and 3 years how to equitably allocate it? Yun ba yung sitwasyon ho natin ngayon?
I'm quite sure, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, that they will heed the will of Congress as the highest policy-making body.
Opo, pero
If
kung
that
wala
is our
naman silang
decision.
solusyon kung paano gastusin, baka underspending din yun. Hindi makakatulong yun sa binabanggit ni Senator Recto na over 1 trillion in savings being passed on from this year to next year.
Mr. President, when we were discussing it, they said they might have to hire certain individuals to help process papers.
Mr.
If
President,
that's
if
the
it's
case.
everyone, no papers need to be processed. In fact, if he's an enrollee, if he's a student, then for example, he doesn't pay tuition fee. Hindi natin kailangan mapunta yung pera sa sino mang staff o clerk para lamang yung processan. Kung estudyante siya, may ID siya, pumasa sa exam, then he doesn't pay tuition. He pays other fees perhaps, but not tuition fees. Again, that's forgive me, Mr. President, Your Honor, that's again an excuse coming from our tertiary education officials as to how and why they cannot do it or will not do it. I do not understand, quite frankly, the resistance. It's been 2-3 years again since I've been hearing this under the same, roughly the same officials of CHED. And I don't understand really why.
Mr. President, I don't think they're unwilling to do it, but I think their first preference is really a voucher system, which they feel is more targeted. But assuming that's the decision of Congress, I don't think they will object. Well, they cannot object, but I'm sure they will support whatever the decision of Congress is. And as the Vice Chair, I would support any initiatives to make education more accessible, Mr. President.
Moving forward, Mr. President, so by the next time we see each other again, same time next year, whether we allocate the money or not, because quite frankly, kung wala silang plano ngayon, at kung wala kayong mabigay ng plano ngayon, ba't namin ibibigay yung pera? Maganda man ang intensyon namin, kung hindi rin nyo lang gagastusin, sayang lang. Lalagay na lang namin sa iba na pwede pang magastos at ma-absorb ng gobyerno. But if you can present a plan between now and by the time we approve the budget, after the BICAM, perhaps we can. But again, I'd like to remind our tertiary education officials, it's been a long time. Hanggang ngayon, voucher pa rin ang sagot. That's simply not acceptable, Mr. President, Your Honor. Kung STFAP ang solusyon, edi mag-STFAP sila sa lahat ng state universities and colleges. Again, it's been 2 years and 3 years. They've had enough time to actually come up with a solution already.
Mr. President, if I may,
Please.
distinguished colleague, I think the SUCs would welcome any such assistance, and they would quickly process it if I'm not mistaken, because they have quite high absorptive capacities and spending. In fact, I think over half of our SUCs have a 90% and above spending rate, Mr. President.
My problem, Mr. Chairman, actually, is the SUCs, when I think if I remember correctly, 2 years ago, when Senator Recto proposed it, the representatives of the SUCs applauded it. Pinatahimik pa nga sila eh. The reservation was coming from CHED, not from the SUCs, which at that time confused us actually.
Yes, I think it's CHED who has a problem sometimes in processing a lot of the scholarships. But maybe you're right that if we eased up on because they have to determine the cutoff. But if we were to make it free and there's no cutoff, everyone is free, then there's less administrative requirement. I see your point. That was also the point of the minority leader, Mr. President.
And it's not as if they will deposit whatever savings they have in the bank. They'll actually spend it, which in turn will help turn the economy.
It's better that they spend it. I would rather they spend it, Mr. President.
One more point, Mr. President. Is the gentleman aware of the National Budget Circular number 461 on the upgrading of SUC faculty positions every 3 years?
This for the salaries, no? It's for
Upgrading.
promotion, Mr.
Yes.
President. Yes.
Were all regions covered in 2017?
Sinong di nasama? Region 5.
Some were not all regions, Mr. President. Region 5, your region, and the Mindanao SUC, some were not also.
In fact, even Region 11 was not included. May I know why?
They did not
What was
foresee-
the reason
they
for
did-
the exclusion of these regions compared to other regions? Hindi nila akalaing mananalo si President Duterte
It was
at yung mga kandidato galing Bicol?
Well, the word chosen by the president of the State Universities and Colleges Association is that there was inadvertence on the part of the DBM when they placed a cap and.
If it is oversight, was it corrected in the House or the Senate version?
Because the DBM has to create the position. The positions are already.
No, the answer is no, Mr. President. But we'll welcome any amendment to that effect. Yeah.
Kung oversight po yung dahilan, di ba dapat wala naman sigurong objection din ng DBM if that's the reason for the
Well, I don't think there's
exclusion.
anyone.
Ang sabing DBM.
Approximately how much is necessary, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Yeah.
To cover the 5 regions, how much is necessary?
Yeah, total yung 5 regions. Rough figure.
I think it's a few hundred million, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. President. Because I think, if memory serves me right, for Region 5, it's about 70 million.
It's about 77
Yeah,
million for Region 5.
Region 5, yes.
A total of about 300?
Around, thereabouts, Mr. President, yeah.
So at the proper time, we will be proposing the corresponding amendment. Would we expect the
I would support
distinguished
that,
sponsor
Mr. President, distinguished colleague.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Your Honor. One last point, Mr. President. Magkano na po yung savings ng mga state universities and colleges sa ngayon? Aggregate, total na po. For 2015,
Yung hindi nyo nagastos, like yun.
pinag-usapan na rin.
As of po, 3.2.
Bakit malaki sa kanya?
Continuing afro nila po. Continuing afro po as of June 30.
So which is correct? 3.5. Can you ask her? Which is the right figure? 6.5.
Maybe ask for a 1 minute suspension. There are two conflicting figures. We just like to reconcile, Mr.
Suspended
President.
for 1 minute.
Hindi, simple lang naman ang question niya. Ang daming binibigis. Savings lang naman ang tayo.
Afro daw po dapat hindi na consider because now
So what is
Okay. Ready to resume, Mr. President?
Session resumed.
Mr. President, distinguished colleague, in answer to your query about the savings, it's 3.582,700,000 approximately
For 2015,
as of June 30, 2016.
as of June 30, 2016. So that's cumulative, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Cumulative? Yes,
Cumulative.
Mr. President, it's cumulative.
Mr. President, Your Honor, last year, how much was it? Has it been going up or has it been decreasing?
Where's the figure for last year? As of last year? June 30 or December?
Just to clarify, Mr. President,
Yes, Mr.
would the
President.
query refer to even savings including internally generated income, all savings of the
All
SUCs?
savings, Mr. President, Your Honor.
What's the figure for savings?
With the provision of the chamber, we declare 1 minute suspension.
Kaya magkano yung carry over for next year? As of June 3rd.
Actually, that's all. That's a figure.
Teka. Assuming they spend the 24 what before. Dito, what you do.
Ito lang yung sa subsidy natin. Hindi kasi ang ganda.
Now, a part of this will be from 2015.
Pero hindi nga ito sa income nila.
Hindi, subsidy yan. So, it will be anywhere on the 7.5%. Kasi meron yung 2015, hindi na naman nalagay sa 2015.
15 na. Yung COA wala.
16 yan, may kuha kami 15. Ito yung kuha na 15. Ito yung 15 na. So more or less ito kaya nila. Ito ko ito, 54.
So parang isang document lang ang gamit natin. We will use it.
Asko. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, in response to the query of the gentleman from Sorsogon,
Yes, Mr. President.
the approximate figure for the savings held by all SUCs is around 33.2 billion pesos, Mr. President.
Broken down, it would include
Broken down, continuing appropriations of 6.8 billion, and from internally generated income, it is around 26.5 billion, Mr.
so
President.
35 billion in retained earnings being held by the state universities and colleges.
Around 33.3 approximately, Mr. President.
33 billion. Mr. President, the figure I have here from DBM itself is for year 2016, the total savings projected of SUCs will be 15 billion. This is out of the appropriations given to them by the national government in 2015 and in 2016. Dahil carried over po yun sa 2015 given the two-year effectivity of the budget. Kasama na po ba to doon sa 35 billion?
Ang kasama po doon yung sa 2015 ho. hindi yung sa 2016.
So yung 7
Hindi pa
billion,
namin binibilang kasi yung binigay po naming figure na 33 is as of December 30, 2015 ho. Pag
So-
dinagdag po natin yung sa 2016, it will go up to around maybe close to 40 billion.
actually it will go up to over 40 billion pesos because yung savings ng 2017 is projected at approximately 7 billion or 6.8 billion via continuing appropriations.
Gentleman is correct, Mr. President. Yeah.
Ibawas mo yun sa 15, so magdadagdag tayo na approximately 8 billion for a total of about 41 billion. Now, my question, Mr. President, is, again, this was a topic and subject matter of debate 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Ano nang ginawa, if any, ng CHED o ng state universities and colleges insofar as utilizing this money is concerned? Mr. President, we are approaching a critical time wherein enrollment will drop. And we know that for a fact. We've been expecting it. Hindi ba tama lang habang mababa ang enrollment, mas mababa ang gastos, doon natin gawin yung mga gusto natin gawin via capital outlay sa ating mga eskwelahan o paaralan para pagbalik ng enrollment sa tamang level, handa na tayo.
No, but it doesn't address the whole amount. That only addresses the subsidy from government, 6 to 7 billion that we get a year. That a continuing appropriation that's carried over because of the 2-year rule. Pero paano yung talagang hawak na nasa bangko? Huwag tayong mag-debate. Yun lang ang sagot.
The answer of the president of the State Colleges Association is that they intend to spend the money, Mr. President, but because there's a 2-year window to spend it, perhaps they're not in a rush to spend it right away.
It has gone up since before, Mr. President.
And they have to
Your
go through
Honor.
bidding procedures also, Mr. President. Yeah.
Mr. President, the figures state that the money is there. It's not even being obligated yet. Mr. President, again, 41 billion is nearly equivalent to what we are giving the SUCs next year. The total is about, for this year rather, total is about 47 billion this year. So it's nearly equivalent to what we're giving them this year.
Mr. President, I do believe the gentleman makes a very valid point, which is that there is money and it should not be kept in the bank and it should be spent for our poorest citizens, and I'm totally in agreement with him on that.
Mr. President, how can we convince, cajole, push the SUCs to actually spend this money? Because my problem, Mr. President, is, again, this has been a debate since 2-3 years ago. Ang ballpen next year, mas mahal kaysa sa ballpen this year. Ang building next year, mas mahal kaysa sa building this year. Dahil pataas naman ang pataas ang presyo ng lahat. While they're delaying, while they're dragging their feet, the cost of actually providing these services, these buildings, these equipment is going up. And the reason and the excuse given to me, Mr. President, that last time we brought this up was, kailangan daw ng reserve money ng SUCs dahil baka mamaya babaan ng gobyerno ang subsidy sa kanila at wala silang perang panakip-butas. But that has not happened, Mr. President, quite frankly, insofar as the SUCs are concerned. And in fact, we can guarantee that at least for the next 6 years or 3 years, it will not change, and I doubt if it will change, especially given the fiscal space and the robust economy that our country is enjoying right now. So again, Mr. President, I appeal to the state universities and colleges, and perhaps we can put by way of a special provision something that would push, convince, and force them, in fact, to spend this money so that they themselves can benefit from it, instead of simply relying on any subsidy or grant coming from the national government. Biruin mo yung binibigyan natin sa taong ito, katumbas nung nakatago nilang pera, hindi naman yata tama at makatarungan yon. Simply because they're afraid the national government might not give the same amount. Kung may takot silang gano'n, sige, kalahati lang. So spend 20 billion. Keep the 21 billion. Kung gusto nyo ng reserve o buffer. But you cannot keep that money away from our students and even our teachers simply because you're afraid that government might not give you more. Government will give you more. Minsan lang ho naman nangyari nung panahon ni Secretary Abad eh. Pero hindi naman ho siguro maulit-ulit yun eh.
Hindi rin, based on recent history, hindi naman ho naulit. You're correct,
Hindi naman
Your
naulit
Honor.
yun eh.
And, but I think it has happened decades ago. So maybe you're right that we should move on and really use that money for those who need it more.
Especially
most.
these
We shall ask, sorry to interrupt, Mr. President, but maybe we can ask the CHED and the SUCs to come up jointly with a plan and draft a provision to the effect that the gentleman desires.
especially for this 2-year window, Mr. President. Again, my frustration, Mr. President, stems from the fact that we talked and discussed, for the first time it was talked about and discussed about 2-3 years ago. And everyone was in agreement. And we were talking about the window that we have right now as we speak, yung 2 years na bababa yung enrollment. And still, no movement or no plans along those lines are being made by the state universities and colleges. Again, this does not mean to say we will reduce the subsidy to SUCs. No. All we're asking for is for you to spend the money. Spend it now while it's still affordable, while it's still cheaper.
Magkano na yun sa UP? Ilang bilyon na yun sa UP? Ilan?
I would be willing to work with the gentleman actually in the period of amendments on how to craft.
Yes, certainly, Mr.
O
President.
kahit mag-matching pa na tayo eh. If only to encourage them, to
I think matching would be a good
incentivize it.
idea because it incentivizes them to spend the money. They get something if they spend. If they counterparting would be a good idea, Mr. President.
Exactly. So at the proper time, we're willing to work with a good gentleman to provide for a mechanism by which we can incentivize, again, convince, and hopefully be able to push the SUCs to spend those monies that they have simply deposited in banks. Counterparting would be one. So for example, if they spend 10 million, we give you 10 million too. Again, this is not for the purpose of reducing the subsidy. This is for the purpose of convincing them to use the money.
Mr. President, I think we're willing to work with the gentleman from Sorsogon and Senator Recto and the CHED officials and the PASUC officials to come up with a win-win solution.
Since he has the staff, Mr. President, Your Honor, you can just go ahead and draft the special provisions and we will just go over it. I'd like to thank the gentleman, Mr. President, Your Honor, for his patience and for his time and for answering the queries of this representation. I'd also like to thank the officials of the state universities and colleges as well as of the CHED. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, distinguished gentleman from
Thank you,
Sorsogon.
Senator Escudero, Majority Leader.
Sen, I think that the lady from Las Piñas, the distinguished lady from Las Piñas wishes to make a manifestation.
Yes, may we now recognize Senator Cynthia Villar, Mr. President. Senator Gordon has withdrawn his reservation.
Senator Villar is recognized.
I just want to make a manifestation that there are many letters coming from the University of the Philippines asking us, the Finance Committee, to give more money for certain projects. And I heard that the SUCs have plenty of money that they haven't spent. Maybe you can give some to the University of the Philippines so that I don't have to talk to Senator Lauren Legarda to make this a few millions to add to the budget of the University of the Philippines.
Not all.
Can I have that commitment from the CHED?
What is the question? I think there are funds for UP left, especially for UP Las Piñas, Mr. President.
No, not for UP Las Piñas. A person is writing me about a boat, buying a boat, which they will use for maritime, what do you call that, research.
Mm-hmm.
And they are asking me to talk to Senator Legarda to insert that in the budget. But if they have plenty of money that they cannot spend, why not give the money to the University of the Philippines? Marine Science Institute. Marine Science Institute.
25 million.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we can look for funds for that.
Yeah, so I don't have to beg from Senator Legarda.
I think Senator Lagarde is receptive to logic and good
So,
policy, Mr. President.
am I getting a commitment to make
We're committed to work with you for that.
Yes, thank you very
yes.
much.
Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. President.
Thank you.
I believe the gentleman from Bulacan, who's also part of the staunch educational advocate, wishes to also interpolate, Mr. President.
What is the pleasure of the gentleman from Bulacan?
Would the distinguished sponsor yield to some questions, Mr. President?
The sponsor may
Mr.
do
President, I will try my best to answer the questions from someone who's worked closely with our educational officials in the last 6 years. It would be an honor. It would be an honor.
I'd be very brief, Mr. President, and thank you, distinguished gentleman from Aurora. Good afternoon po sa ating mga kasamahan sa education sector, especially sa Commission on Higher Education. Let me acknowledge our dear former colleague, Secretary Licuanan. Just wanted to ask, Mr. Chair, Mr. President, with regard to displaced personnel, just to point out, I think, I'm not sure about this data, and please correct me if I'm wrong. CHED data shows that 3,273 personnel were displaced as of October 2016 due to the K-12 transition. May I know how many of the displaced personnel are now teaching in the senior high school, since teaching personnel are more affected than non-teaching personnel?
The figures are correct, Mr. President, cited by Your Honor, and 925 displaced faculty were hired for senior high school teaching under the DepEd Green Lane for displaced faculty.
Out of the 3,000,
Yes.
900
Yes,
were
Your Honor.
hired. Pwede po bang malaman, Mr. Chair, Mr. President, kung ano po yung gagawin or plano doon sa mga hindi kasama sa na-hire? Because I'm sure there are programs like giving scholarships, pagbibigay ng mas mataas na kaalaman at kasanayan para po sa kanila.
Well, there are programs available for them, Mr. President, distinguished colleague. Under the DOLE, there is the AMP, or the Adjustment Measures Program, which is both for teaching and non-teaching staff, where the DOLE offers income support, employment facilitation, training, and livelihood. And the CHED has development grants also for those who wish to take up further studies. So there's scholarship for grad studies, sectoral engagement grants, professional advancement grants, senior high school support grants, Your Honor.
Mr. President, during the hearing, may mga ilan po lumapit sa atin tungkol dito at ilan sa mga complaints nila ay yung mahigpit na panuntunan ng Department of Labor and Employment, and I will raise this in the budget hearing of DOLE. Meron na po ba tayong proper coordination, Mr. Chairman, tungkol po dito sa mga, for instance, hinihiling po doon sa mga PhD holders natin na kung ano-anong mga datos na o requirements na kailangan pa ho nila na tila baga parang given naman, Mr. President?
Yes, I do remember that, distinguished colleague. The comment was that the DOLE requirements were quite voluminous in terms of documentary requirements. And so I think, I know that the two agencies are working together to have, or to facilitate processing of claims, because these people clearly need support.
Baka ho po pwede na lang makahingi ng something o ginagawa ng ating CHED at DOLE tungkol po dito para sa pagbalik sa akin ng mga binabanggit natin na mga professionals, teachers, masagot din po natin at malaman nilang may ginawa po talaga ang ating mga ahensya.
I will ask them to submit to the distinguished gentleman from Bulacan, Mr. President, what they have done. They have met a number of times, and there are interagency efforts to really simplify the requirements.
Another thing, Mr. President, in line with this representation's advocacy to ENDO, may I know how many contractual personnel, both teaching and non-teaching, are working in the higher education institutions?
Total contractual and casual faculty is 10,200 approximately, Mr. President. As for non-teaching, it's 32,000.
About 2,000.
32,000, Mr. President.
32,000. I just hope, thank you for the data, and we'll take that into consideration as we hear ito pong ating pinagkakaabalahang ending the evils of contractualization, kasi naniniwala po tayo na na kung ito ay ating ipupush, magsimula dapat tayo sa ating bakuran. Last point, second to the last point na gusto ko lang hong pagtuunan ng pansin, we talk about the Lad Rise Education Act. I think this program, Mr. President, will be beneficial to families who may find it difficult to enroll their children in college from high school because of financial constraints, and to consider taking up tech voc courses, which are shorter in duration and fees are relatively cheaper. May I know, Mr. President, what is the proposed budget for the implementation of RA 10647 or the Lad Rise Education Act of 2015, na alam po natin na ang sponsor mismo na nag-sponsor ngayon ang principal sponsor?
Thank you, Mr. President. I know the distinguished gentleman from Bulacan was pushing for this as early as the 12th Congress, if I'm not mistaken, and supported it as the chief of or the secretary of TESDA. The budgetary allotment for 2017 is an approximately 950 million, broken down into 810 million for student scholarships, 135 million for institutional development assistance for both higher education and tech voc institutions, and approximately 9 million for curriculum development and enhancement, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Related to the Lad Rise Education Act, Section 5 of RA 10647, it says here, education agencies are directed to identify priority disciplines and programs for ladderization, taking into account labor market realities in consultation with the industry and related agencies. Have we identified all these programs, priorities for ladderization?
Yes, Mr. President, distinguished colleague. If I may read them, there is agriculture and agricultural technology, business education, which includes hotel and restaurant management and tourism travel management, as well as office administration, criminology, engineering and architecture, different types of engineering, information technology education, health education, which includes dental medicine, optometry, medical technology, midwifery, pharmacy, respiratory therapy, radiologic technology, maritime education, which would include marine engineering and marine transportation, and teacher education, distinguished colleague, Mr. President.
May I know if semiconductor and electronics also part of the industry? Are
Yes,
they?
yes, it is, Mr. President.
Thank you. Well, Mr. President, based on CHED data, there were 26,782 TVET graduates who continued to enroll in the BS degree programs. May I know the top 10 courses taken by TVET graduates under the LEP? Siguro, Mr. President, hihingi na lang po ako ng kopya. And perhaps another question that I'd like to raise, kung yung courses po of the top 10 courses taken by TVET graduates under the LEP, which are they considered oversubscribed or overcrowded also by CHED, para alam po natin?
We can furnish the gentleman from Bulacan, Mr. President, the list, or if he prefers, I can read it because it's not such a long list. 10 courses.
I can just get the
Okay.
list,
Okay.
Mr. President.
We'll happily furnish it. Thank you, distinguished
I don't want
colleague.
to take much of the time of this committee. And one last thing that I'd like to raise before this budget deliberation is the issue of Philippine Qualifications Framework. I raised this yesterday with the in deliberation of the budget of the Department of Education. I know that DepEd is in charge of the Philippine Qualifications Framework Coordinating Council. And during the budget of TESDA, the budget deliberation of TESDA, we also, and the distinguished sponsor was present when I asked this question, if they are also on board when it comes to fulfilling our targets when you talk about the Philippine Qualifications Framework. I would just like to get the commitment by CHED on this particular matter, and if they are also keen on reaching the proposed target for the Philippine Qualifications Framework.
Yes, the chairman is unequivocal, Mr. President, in her commitment, and she mentioned that the three agencies involved, including the agency his honor used to head, are in fact now in coordination. In fact, talking to some resource persons from abroad to get a feel for what is being done in other countries regarding
Yes,
the
and I
qualifications
would agree
framework.
with that in the previous administration, but I think the last meeting of the Philippine Qualifications Framework Coordinating Council was held last May of 2016. So again, I am just pounding this issue, and if there's a need for this representation to even host the meeting, I would gladly volunteer, Mr. President.
Baka may ma-insecure, Mr. President, pag ikaw ang nag-host. No, but the gentleman is correct, Mr. President, that they've not met formally. But I think, thankfully, there's still continuity with respect to some of, maybe not at the minister level or the secretary level, but there is continuity at the lower level. So they're discussing, and I guess it's a part of the learning curve of the new secretaries that they have to learn what is pending and what they inherited from you. But that pledge of the chair is outstanding, and they pledge to come up with. In fact, I will furnish the gentleman, the chairman of the Committee on Labor, the former head of TESDA, with a list of target dates for completion.
I would be happy to receive it, Mr. President. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat po sa buong CHED families at SUCs, at magandang tanghali po.
Yeah, I thank the gentleman from Bulacan for his questions, Mr. President.
Majority Leader,
One last point from Senator Villar, Mr. President.
Senator Villar is once more recognized.
No, Mr. President, I just want to make some clarification because we are requesting the Department of Agriculture to pay all the backlog of, because the students are coming to us, they're complaining that the
Okay.
Department of Agriculture didn't pay their scholarship to CHED and SUCs, the ASEF scholarship. And according to record, the backlog is 59 million. DA has paid 23 million, so they still have to pay more than 30 million, but they're complaining that they have no, what do you call this? The papers are not complete for them to be able to pay. So we're forcing them to pay. So please fulfill all the requirements so that the Department of Agriculture can pay their ASEF obligation to the SUCs and the CHED. Yeah.
May we inquire from the distinguished lady from Las Piñas, is she addressing her query to the CHED regarding the...
But it involves all SUCs and the CHED, so we cannot ask individual SUCs.
I see. So
the
it's
CHED.
addressed to all SUCs.
SUCs through the CHED, because we're really working hard for the Department of Agriculture to pay their obligation because the students are complaining to us. We will request that a person from the CHED would be the one in charge to take care of this so that we will know whom to follow up.
The CHED commits to follow
Yes,
up
can
and
you give
process
us
these.
the name of the person who will be in charge?
Who is
Because-
the person?
Ikaw na rin.
CHED Commissioner Sanggalang.
Okay. And of course, another problem is the TESDA scholarship in the state universities and colleges. We're encouraging the state universities and colleges to teach agriculture through TESDA. In fact, the TESDA will pay for the scholarship through your mandate of extension. So we want to know how you are doing about this. You said there are 56 state universities and colleges who are now accredited with TESDA. We want the list. We want where this is. So I just want to get a commitment from the chair that they will push through with their extension mandate to teach agriculture in their different campuses in the Philippines, because we want to be able to reach as many farmers as possible to learn their technology and their financial literacy, because according to study, they have to know how to run their farm as a small business, and at the same time they have to learn new technologies in order for them to be competitive. And we hope that the state universities and colleges, through their extension mandate, would be accredited with TESDA, so that TESDA can pay for the scholarship of these students. We want that commitment from CHED.
They have given this report to your
Yes.
staff,
Yeah.
distinguished lady from Las Piñas.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, distinguished colleague.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move there are no more interpellations for the Commission on Higher Education, Mr. President. Therefore, no, I'm sorry, the state universities and colleges, I mean. Therefore, I move that the budget of the state universities and colleges. Hindi.
May tatanong sa chat?
Meron eh.
Okay.
Hindi, magkaiwala yun eh. I move that the budget of the state universities and colleges be deemed submitted for
Any
consideration.
objection? Hearing none. Approved.
Mr. President, may we now tackle the budget of the Commission on Higher Education? I know some of the issues were raised by the other members, but we did not call for it earlier. So we call for it now, and may I ask that Senator Laila De Lima be recognized, together with the sponsor, Senator Angara.
All right. The consideration of the budget of the Commission on Higher Education is in order. The sponsor, Senator Angara, is recognized. And before we recognize Senator De Lima, can Senator Angara spread into the record the budget, the proposed budget of CHED as contained in the committee report?
We're ready, Mr. President, to receive questions from the
Yes,
distinguished lady from Kamsur.
The chair wanted the sponsor, if he agrees, to spread into the record the budget of the CHED.
Mr. President, under the GAB, it is 10,467,475,000, Mr. President.
And in the CHED, I'm sorry, in the committee report,
It is 487,475,000, Mr. President.
so the committee report adopted the GAB proposal.
By and large, Mr. President, yes.
All right. Senator De Lima is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know it's already lunch break. Just one point with respect to the CHED's budget. So as confirmed by the good sponsor, in the GAB, the proposed budget is 10.46 billion, and a slight increase per the committee report. I think an increase of just 20 million. Is that correct? 20
That's correct,
million.
Mr. President. It's in the Tulong Dunong program of the Commission.
And can this representation seek confirmation from the good sponsor that CHED's proposed budget actually had a huge slash from the NEP
That's correct.
to GAB?
That's correct,
Can
distinguished
you
colleague.
give us the figures, please?
The NEP, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, provided for around 12.5 approximately billion, 12.5 billion, and the GAB. So the House of Representatives decreased the amount for CHED by around 2.03 billion, and the 1 billion cut was from the K-12 remedial measures. There was another 1 billion cut from research and scholarship, that is the PICARI program, and around 29.2 million was removed from the incentives and scholarships of the central office, Mr. President.
The 1 billion cut from the K to 12, is that the K to 12, you mentioned remedial or transition program?
Transition program, it's the same one.
Okay.
Distinguished colleague.
So, 1 billion from the K to 12 transition program and 1 billion from the CHED's PICARI project. Can you enlighten us on the merits of the PICARI project? Because I want to understand why the proposed budget from CHED itself was not considered at the House level, and therefore
Well, the PICARI
Taken
project
out.
is a continuing project, distinguished colleague. It is research. It is meant to upgrade the capacities of our high-level teaching faculty by having collaboration with many universities in the United States. So a lot of this is
this
in
project started when?
2 or 3 years ago. 2013, distinguished colleague, Mr.
And
President.
it is meant to be an annual
Yes, it is a
initiative.
multi-year, it's a 5-year capacity building initiative.
May we know the reasons for the decision of the House of Representatives to take out that 1 billion support for that project?
This
There must be a
representation
reason.
has no knowledge of the reason, Mr.
So
President.
CHED also
Yeah.
doesn't know?
Well, they are shaking their head, distinguished colleague. But perhaps I would only, they're quite surprised, CHED, but I could only surmise that the House did not feel that it was a priority, and they realigned some funds to scholarships, which perhaps I can only surmise that they felt was a bigger priority, Mr. President.
So the 1 billion cut also from the K-12 transition program, I suppose, was also realigned to the same scholarship?
Well, it's difficult to
Or to
trace because money is fungible, Mr. President. But what we saw is that 1.3 of the approximately 2 billion cut was realigned to MOE of the SUCs.
Is the good sponsor minded to, or can the good sponsor consider proposing
I think this
the
matter.
restoration?
I'm a believer in the PICARI project, but I think the decision would rest in the body as a whole and with the chair discussing the matter, Mr. President.
But of course, if the body, if the plenary would decide to restore the 2 billion, either or both of the budget cuts from PICARI and then also from K-12 transition program, it is of course not to be at the expense of, because we can surmise that those were realigned to perhaps
Yes.
the SUCs,
The
because there were a lot that were restored at the SUCs budget, correct?
That's right, Madam.
So if you can find a way.
We will look
of-
for
of-
ways, and along with the chair of the committee, distinguished colleague.
I guess that's all I need to say.
Yeah.
Although, regarding the point earlier raised by Senator Lacson, indeed, the body has to be very careful in the final language of the budget, particularly in relation to the possible violation of the Supreme Court ruling in the PDAF case, because there seems to be some gray areas there. It's so easy to say that, of course, the lawmakers can always propose scholarship projects and whatever other projects to the agency concerned during the budget preparation. And then, of course, at our level, in the budget authorization, Congress, having the power of the purse, can always make modifications on the proposals from the executive. But what is absolutely contemplated in the prohibition in the Supreme Court case is the intervention of the lawmakers at the post post-enactment stage. Now, but if we come to think of it, we might be really treading into dangerous path in the sense that when lawmakers do recommend and provide for the budget, for their favored projects, then that takes away the leeway, the discretion of the executive during the execution stage. So it's a gray area, but it's still dangerous. So we have to be very careful so that we will not again find ourselves under hot waters. And I mean, some lawmakers would find themselves to be in hot waters because of that a Supreme Court ruling on PDAF. Kasi nga naman, kung galing na mismo sa mga lawmakers yung mga scholars, then restricted na yung prerogative, the action of the executive in terms of its main scholarship program. So that's just an additional manifestation to that aired earlier by our distinguished colleague, Senator Lacson. Thank you very much.
I do agree, and I thank the lady from, distinguished lady from Kamsur for her very important point. And I agree, it's a fine line, and we must be careful to stay on the right side of it, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to close the period of interpellation for the budget of the Commission on Higher Education and consider the proposed budget as deemed submitted.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Mr. President, I move to suspend the session until 2:30 this afternoon, wherein the Department of Justice budget will be taken up.
Session suspended until 2:30 this afternoon.